My selfish mom seduced every guy I dated. Until she met my gay personal trainer when she accidentally showed up at our private gym session, wearing nothing but a sports bra and booty shorts she'd stolen from my dresser. She bent over repeatedly in front of Marcus, pretending to need help with her form, and even faked dropping her water bottle between his legs. When she invited him for a protein shake at her place while I was in the changing room, I heard Marcus's polite laugh echo through the empty gym before he said something that made my mother's flirtatious giggle die instantly. The silence that followed was so heavy I could practically feel it pressing against the locker room door where I stood frozen, my hand still on the handle I'd been about to push open. Through the crack in the door, I watched my mother's face transform from seductive confidence to confused shock as Marcus gently touched her shoulder and said something I couldn't quite hear. Whatever words he used, they made her step back so quickly she nearly tripped over the yoga mat she'd strategically positioned behind her. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she managed to stammer something about needing to leave suddenly, grabbing her designer gym bag and practically running toward the exit without even glancing toward the changing rooms where she thought I was still showering. Marcus stood there watching her retreat, then shook his head with what looked like genuine pity before turning to adjust the weight machine she'd been pretending to struggle with moments before. I'm Jessica Marie Holland, 28 years old, and my mother, Diana, has been systematically destroying my relationship since I turned 16 and brought home my first real boyfriend. She's 47 now, works as a real estate agent, and has maintained her appearance with the dedication of someone who views youth as currency and men as ATMs. Growing up, I thought every mother competed with their daughter for male attention, until my college roommate looked at me with genuine horror when I casually mentioned my mom making out with my prom date in our garage. What I didn't know until 3 weeks ago was that my mother had been keeping detailed notes in a leather journal hidden in her closet, documenting every guy I dated with scores based on their income potential, looks, and what she called their training potential. That journal is currently sitting in my car's glove compartment, and the information inside it is about to make my mother's carefully constructed world collapse in ways she never saw coming. The gym incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. I'd been working with Marcus Chen for 6 months, 3 times a week at this boutique fitness studio that costs more per session than most people spend on groceries. Diana knew this because she'd made a habit of dropping by my apartment unannounced, going through my mail, and questioning me about every aspect of my life with the intensity of a detective interrogating a suspect. She'd seen Marcus's business card on my refrigerator 2 months earlier and immediately started asking pointed questions about whether he was single, what kind of car he drove, and if I'd noticed his arms because she certainly had when she'd looked him up on Instagram. I should have recognized the pattern immediately. It was identical to what happened with Tyler, my boyfriend during sophomore year of college, who Diana had convinced to help her move furniture one weekend while I was visiting my grandmother in Portland. By the time I returned, Tyler could barely look at me and broke up with me 3 days later via text message. Then there was James, the law student I dated for 8 months, who suddenly started canceling our plans and acting distant until I found out from his roommate that my mother had been sending him late-night texts about feeling lonely and misunderstood. The list went on. Ethan, the graphic designer who quit his job and moved across the country after what he would only describe as an uncomfortable situation involving my mother. Robert, who ghosted me completely after meeting Diana at my birthday dinner and wouldn't return my calls for weeks. What made Marcus different wasn't just that my mother's usual tactics wouldn't work on him. It was that he saw through her immediately. And unlike the other men in my life who'd been too polite or too weak to tell me the truth, he decided to tell me everything. That evening after the gym incident, Marcus called and asked if we could meet for coffee. He brought printouts of Instagram DMs my mother had been sending him for weeks, starting innocently enough with compliments about his training expertise and gradually escalating to late-night messages about how she wished she had a man who took care of his body the way Marcus did. But here's where the story gets interesting. While Marcus was showing me these messages, explaining apologetically that he'd initially ignored them, but felt I deserved to know when Diana showed up at the gym in my clothes, something clicked in my brain. I remembered the journal I'd found in my mother's closet 3 weeks earlier, when I was looking for my grandmother's wedding ring that Diana had borrowed without asking. I'd photographed every page with my phone, thinking I might need the evidence someday, but not quite sure for what. Now, sitting across from Marcus in that coffee shop with Diana's increasingly desperate messages displayed on his phone screen, I knew exactly what I needed to do. That night, I went home and read through every photograph of my mother's journal entries again. She'd rated my boyfriends on a scale of 1 to 10 across multiple categories: financial stability, physical attractiveness, malleability. She'd written detailed plans for how to isolate each one from me, what vulnerabilities to exploit, and in 2 cases, she'd actually documented the dates and locations where she'd slept with them. Tyler scored an 8.5 overall. James was a 9.2. There were notes about others I'd never even told her about, which meant she'd been going through my phone and computer for years. But the journal contained something else that made my blood run cold and then immediately hot with rage. Diana had been systematically sabotaging my career opportunities as well. She'd contacted 3 different companies where I'd interviewed for marketing positions, posing as a concerned family member to share confidential information about my supposed mental health struggles and medication dependence. I'd wondered why those jobs had fallen through despite excellent interviews. Now I knew. My own mother had been destroying my professional life while simultaneously seducing every man I'd tried to build a relationship with. Marcus listened to all of this without interrupting, occasionally shaking his head or muttering something under his breath that sounded like disbelief, mixed with anger on my behalf. When I finished explaining, he leaned back in his chair and said something that changed everything. He told me his ex-husband was a lawyer who specialized in harassment cases, and that some of what Diana had done probably crossed legal lines. He also mentioned that his current boyfriend worked in social media marketing and had helped expose several predatory individuals by carefully documenting their behavior and making it public in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away. The plan started forming that night over cold coffee and shared disgust at my mother's behavior. Marcus would continue pretending to be interested in Diana's attention, encouraging her to be more explicit in her messages and attempts at seduction. I would gather more evidence from her house during my regular visits, looking for anything else that might show a pattern of this behavior. And Marcus's boyfriend, Julian, would help me create a comprehensive timeline of Diana's interference in my life, complete with testimonials from the men she'd targeted if any of them were willing to talk. Over the next 2 weeks, Diana escalated exactly as we'd predicted. She started showing up at the gym during my training sessions, always dressed inappropriately and always with some excuse about wanting to start a fitness routine of her own. Marcus played along beautifully, accepting her Instagram follow request, responding to her messages with just enough encouragement to keep her interested but never crossing any line that might make him uncomfortable. She invited him to dinner. She asked if he did private training sessions at clients' homes. She sent him a photo of herself in a bikini, claiming she wanted his professional opinion on her physique. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything and digging deeper into my mother's life. I discovered she'd been having affairs with married men for years, using her real estate connections to meet wealthy clients and seduce them with promises of discretion. I found emails where she'd blackmailed 2 of these men for money, threatening to tell their wives if they didn't help her with various expenses. I uncovered evidence that she'd been stealing from my grandmother before she passed away, forging checks and selling family heirlooms that were supposed to be mine. The evidence kept piling up, and with each new discovery, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about the men she'd taken from me anymore. This was about years of manipulation, theft, and calculated cruelty from someone who was supposed to love and protect me. Diana had spent my entire adult life treating me like competition and using me as bait to lure in men she could control or exploit. The gym incident with Marcus was just the latest in a long pattern of predatory behavior, and I was done being her victim. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when Diana called me crying, claiming she'd locked herself out of her house and needed to stay with me for a few days while a locksmith could come out. I knew this was a lie because I'd installed a tracking app on her phone 2 weeks earlier when she'd left it unattended at a family lunch. According to the GPS data, she'd been at her house all morning and had only left to drive to my apartment building 20 minutes before calling. This was another one of her manipulations, probably designed to give her access to my space so she could snoop through my things or manufacture some crisis that would require my attention and resources. I let her in anyway, playing the concerned daughter while internally cataloging every word she said for future reference. Diana settled onto my couch with her overnight bag, immediately launching into a dramatic story about how the locks had been changed by a vindictive ex-boyfriend she'd been seeing who'd discovered she was also dating someone else. She described this man in detail, enough that I was able to identify him later as Richard Thornton, a married father of 3, whose wife attended the same yoga studio as my mother. The casual way Diana discussed destroying this man's marriage while simultaneously playing victim was breathtaking in its audacity. That evening, Marcus texted to say Diana had sent him another message asking if he was free for dinner that night. She'd included a photo of herself in a tight red dress with the caption wondering what he thought of her outfit choice. Marcus had responded that he was busy, but maybe another time, which had prompted Diana to ask when his next availability was, and whether he'd ever considered doing overnight training sessions because she learned best with intensive one-on-one instruction. The innuendo was so transparent, it would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic and predatory. While Diana slept in my guest room that night, I went through her phone using the passcode I'd watched her enter dozens of times. The messages were worse than I'd imagined. She had active conversations with 7 different men, all of whom she was manipulating in various ways. 3 were married, 2 were significantly younger than her, including one who was 23 and clearly uncomfortable with her aggressive advances based on his short, polite responses. She'd sent explicit photos to 4 of them, and in her messages with a man named David, she'd explicitly discussed her strategy of targeting men her daughter dated because they were pre-vetted as having qualities she valued and were easier to manipulate due to their existing connection to our family. I photographed everything. Her messages, her emails, her banking app showing deposits from multiple men, her calendar with color-coded entries for different romantic interests. I found drafted emails she'd never sent, including one to my current boss filled with fabricated concerns about my work performance, and another to Marcus's gym asking if they knew their trainer was engaging in inappropriate relationships with clients. That last one made my hands shake with rage because she was already preparing to destroy Marcus's reputation if he rejected her advances, just like she'd done to several of my ex-boyfriends who'd tried to tell me the truth about her behavior. Sunday morning, Diana woke up cheerful and made herself at home in my kitchen, cooking breakfast and chattering about how nice it was to spend quality time together. She asked pointed questions about Marcus, whether I thought he was interested in dating anyone, if I'd noticed him paying attention to anyone at the gym. I played dumb, telling her I thought he might be seeing someone but wasn't sure, watching her eyes light up at the challenge. She immediately pivoted to talking about how she'd always been able to win over any man she set her sights on, how confidence and knowing what men really wanted was the key to keeping them interested. The conversation was so revealing, I turned on my phone's voice recorder and let her keep talking. Diana spent 20 minutes essentially confessing to decades of manipulative behavior, framing it as feminine wisdom and survival skills in a male-dominated world. She talked about her philosophy that men were resources to be managed, that competition between women was natural, and daughters shouldn't expect their mothers to handicap themselves out of some outdated notion of maternal loyalty. She said I'd understand when I was older, that I'd realize she'd actually been teaching me valuable lessons about how the world really worked. Later that afternoon, Marcus called to say Diana had shown up at his apartment building. She'd somehow gotten his address, probably from public records or by following him from the gym, and was waiting in the lobby claiming she needed to discuss something important about her training program. Marcus's building had security cameras, which meant we now had video evidence of Diana stalking him to his home. He handled it perfectly, coming down to the lobby with his boyfriend Julian and introducing him to Diana as his partner of 3 years. The security footage Julian later obtained showed Diana's face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and then unmistakable fury before she turned and walked out without saying another word. That evening, Diana returned to my apartment in a rage. She ranted about Marcus wasting her time, leading her on, and humiliating her in front of his boyfriend. She called him deceptive and manipulative, seemingly oblivious to the irony. She demanded I stop training with him immediately because he was clearly unprofessional and possibly dangerous. When I calmly asked what had happened, she spun an elaborate story about Marcus making inappropriate advances toward her and then using his boyfriend as a shield when she'd confronted him about his behavior. The lies came so easily, it was almost impressive. I recorded that conversation too, letting her dig herself deeper while I nodded sympathetically and made vague agreeing sounds. She was so convinced of her own narrative that she didn't notice I wasn't actually committing to anything she demanded. She spent 2 hours detailing Marcus's supposed misconduct, creating an entirely fictional version of events that would have destroyed his career and reputation if anyone believed her. She discussed reporting him to the gym, leaving negative reviews online, and possibly even filing a police report for harassment. Tuesday morning, while Diana was still sleeping off the wine she'd consumed the night before while ranting about Marcus, I met with Julian and Marcus at a coffee shop downtown. Julian worked for a digital marketing agency that specialized in reputation management, which meant he knew exactly how to present information online in ways that would get maximum attention and engagement. He'd spent the weekend compiling everything I'd given him into a comprehensive timeline with screenshots, photos, and recorded conversations, all organized in a format that was easy to understand and impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding or exaggeration. We discussed the ethics of what we were planning. Julian pointed out that everything we had was factual, documented, and involved behavior that had genuinely harmed multiple people. This wasn't revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was exposure of a pattern of predatory behavior that would likely continue if left unchecked. Marcus added that Diana's threat to file false reports about him crossed a line that required response, not just for his protection, but for any future targets of her manipulation. We all agreed that Diana had been enabled too long by people who were too polite, too embarrassed, or too afraid of family drama to hold her accountable. The plan was simple but comprehensive. Julian would create a detailed blog post using an anonymous platform, outlining Diana's pattern of behavior with all supporting evidence redacted to protect identities, but still showing the scale and consistency of her actions. The post would include her manipulation of my relationships, her theft from family members, her blackmail of married men, and her stalking of Marcus, all presented as a case study in predatory behavior rather than a personal attack. We'd share it initially within targeted communities where people discuss toxic family dynamics and manipulative behavior, letting it spread organically while monitoring for Diana's response. Simultaneously, I would be reaching out to the men Diana had victimized, starting with my ex-boyfriends and including the married men she'd been blackmailing. Some might not want to participate, but even a few testimonials would establish that this wasn't an isolated incident or a daughter's vindictive imagination. Marcus's ex-husband, the lawyer, had agreed to send cease and desist letters to Diana on behalf of himself and any other men who wanted legal protection from her continued contact or retaliation. Everything would happen within the same 48-hour period, overwhelming Diana before she could mount an effective defense or counter-narrative. Wednesday night, I told Diana she needed to go back to her own house because I had work commitments that required privacy and focus. She resisted initially, suggesting she could just stay out of my way, but I was firm in a way I'd never been with her before. Something in my tone must have registered because she actually packed her things without the usual guilt-tripping or manufactured emergencies. Before she left, she hugged me and said she was glad we'd had this quality time together, that she felt like we'd really bonded. I hugged her back and said absolutely nothing, watching her walk out my door knowing it was probably the last peaceful interaction we'd ever have. Thursday morning at 9 a.m., Julian's blog post went live. By noon, it had been shared in 6 different online communities. By evening, it had over 3,000 views and counting. The first message came from Tyler at 2 in the morning on Friday. He'd seen the blog post shared in a support group for people dealing with manipulative family members, and he'd recognized enough details to know it was about Diana despite the names being changed. His text was 3 paragraphs long, apologizing for ghosting me in college and finally explaining what had actually happened that weekend. He'd helped my mother move furniture. Diana had gotten him drunk, made advances he'd initially rejected, and then when he'd tried to leave, she'd taken photos of him passed out on her couch and threatened to send them to me with a story about him making unwanted advances toward her unless he ended our relationship quietly. He'd been 20 years old and terrified, so he'd complied. By Friday morning, I had messages from 4 more men Diana had targeted. James, the law student, sent a detailed email describing how my mother had shown up at his apartment claiming I'd sent her to check on him because I was worried about his mental health. She'd gradually escalated from concerned maternal figure to seductress over several visits, and when he'd finally told her he wasn't interested, she'd started sending his school's administration anonymous complaints about his behavior toward female students. He'd nearly lost his scholarship defending himself against accusations that came from nowhere and made no sense until now. Robert, who'd disappeared after my birthday dinner 3 years ago, called me directly. His voice was shaking as he explained that Diana had contacted him weeks before that dinner, claiming to be a family friend who wanted to warn him that I had serious mental health issues, including stalking behavior and delusions about relationships that didn't exist. She'd shown him fabricated text messages supposedly from my therapist, concerned emails supposedly from other ex-boyfriends warning him away. By the time we'd had dinner, he'd been convinced I was dangerous and my mother was trying to protect him. When he'd ghosted me, Diana had continued contacting him for months, trying to start a relationship with him while pretending to commiserate about how difficult I'd made things for both of them. The stories kept coming throughout Friday and into Saturday. An ex-boyfriend from high school I'd barely thought about in years sent a message through Facebook explaining that Diana had told him I was cheating on him with multiple people and offered to console him through the betrayal. He'd believed her because why would anyone's mother lie about something like that? And he'd spent years feeling guilty about how he'd treated me in the aftermath. A coworker from my first job after college reached out to say Diana had contacted his wife 2 years ago with fabricated evidence of an affair between us that had nearly ended his marriage and had gotten him fired when his wife had confronted his boss. Each new testimony added another layer to the pattern Julian had documented. This wasn't occasional bad behavior or poor judgment. This was systematic, calculated predation spanning decades. Diana had been doing this since I was a teenager, possibly earlier, but those victims would be harder to find now. She'd refined her techniques over time, learning what worked and what didn't, keeping detailed records of her successes like some kind of trophy collection. The journal I'd found was just the latest version. Who knew how many others existed or had been destroyed when they'd served their purpose? Saturday afternoon, Diana called me 17 times in 2 hours. I didn't answer any of them. She left voicemails that progressed from confused to angry to desperate to threatening. The first few claimed she'd seen horrible lies about her online and couldn't understand who would make up such vicious stories. The middle ones accused me of betraying her, of being an ungrateful daughter who'd turned against her own mother. The later ones oscillated between begging me to call her back and threatening legal action for defamation. The final voicemail was her crying, claiming she'd been nothing but a loving mother and couldn't believe I'd participate in destroying her reputation. I saved every single voicemail. So did Marcus, because she'd called him too, leaving messages accusing him of conspiring against her and threatening to report him to every licensing board she could find. She'd also sent him a series of increasingly unhinged text messages claiming he'd led her on, that he'd been flirting with her deliberately, that his boyfriend was probably covering for him. Julian received emails at his work address somehow Diana had gotten access to that threatened legal action against him personally for harassment and libel. She was lashing out in every direction, confirming through her own reaction that everything in the blog post was accurate. Sunday morning, my aunt called. She's Diana's younger sister and had always seemed oblivious to my mother's true nature. She'd seen the blog post because someone in her book club had shared it, and she'd recognized details from family gatherings and stories she'd heard over the years. She started crying on the phone, apologizing for not seeing it sooner or doing more to protect me. Then she told me something I hadn't known. Diana had done similar things to her when they were younger, stealing boyfriends and sabotaging opportunities. Their mother, my grandmother, had known, but had always made excuses or swept it under the rug because addressing it would have meant acknowledging how damaged Diana was. My aunt had more stories. Diana had stolen money from their mother during her final years, sold off family heirlooms that were supposed to be divided between them, and had even tried to seduce my aunt's husband at a Christmas party years ago. My uncle had told my aunt immediately, and they'd quietly started limiting contact with Diana afterward, but they'd never told me because they assumed Diana wouldn't target her own daughter the same way. They'd been wrong, and my aunt's guilt was palpable through the phone. She offered to provide a written statement detailing everything she knew, including financial documentation of Diana's theft from my grandmother's estate. By Monday morning, the blog post had over 15,000 views and had been picked up by several online publications that covered stories about toxic family dynamics and psychological manipulation. Julian had been fielding interview requests, all of which he was declining to protect everyone's privacy, but the interest level indicated this was resonating with people far beyond our immediate situation. The comments section was filled with people sharing their own stories of maternal manipulation and competition, creating a space where previously isolated victims realized they weren't alone or crazy. Diana's response was to hire a lawyer who sent cease and desist letters to me, Marcus, Julian, and the platform hosting the blog post. The letters claimed defamation and demanded immediate removal of all content, plus financial compensation for damage to Diana's reputation and mental health. Marcus's ex-husband, who'd been expecting exactly this response, had already prepared counter-documentation showing that every claim in the blog post was supported by evidence, and that truth is an absolute defense against defamation. He sent back letters explaining in legal detail why Diana's threats had no merit, and that any attempt to pursue litigation would result in all evidence being entered into public record, including her own journal entries and the testimonies of her numerous victims. Tuesday, Diana showed up at my workplace. Security had to escort her out when she started screaming in the lobby that I'd ruined her life and destroyed her reputation with lies. The entire incident was captured on security cameras, showing Diana looking unhinged and aggressive while I stood calmly at the reception desk asking her to leave. My boss, who'd received one of Diana's poison pen emails years ago and had been skeptical about keeping me on as a result, witnessed the whole thing. Afterward, she pulled me into her office and apologized for ever doubting me, saying Diana's behavior just now explained so much about the warning she'd received and made it clear who the actual problem was. That evening, I received an email from David, one of the married men Diana had been blackmailing. He'd seen the blog post and realized he wasn't alone in being victimized by her. He wanted to know if there was any kind of legal action being organized because he had evidence of extortion, including bank transfers Diana had forced him to make with threats of exposing their affair to his wife. His wife already knew now because he'd told her everything after seeing the blog post, and while their marriage was damaged, they were working through it together. He was done protecting Diana out of shame and was ready to press charges if possible. Wednesday brought 2 more similar emails from men Diana had been blackmailing. Both had evidence of financial demands backed by threats of exposure. Marcus's ex-husband confirmed that this constituted criminal extortion in our state, and that if enough victims came forward with documentation, there could be grounds for prosecution. He began compiling a comprehensive file to present to the district attorney's office, coordinating with all the men who were willing to participate in building a case. Some wanted to remain anonymous if possible, but all were committed to stopping Diana from continuing this pattern with future victims. By Thursday, exactly 1 week after the blog post went live, Diana's entire life was unraveling. Her real estate license was under review after several complaints were filed about her using client relationships for personal gain. 3 of the men she'd been simultaneously dating had compared notes and ended things publicly, with one posting his own detailed account of her manipulation tactics. Her landlord had received so many calls and complaints from people who'd seen the blog post that he was considering options for terminating her lease, based on evidence of illegal activity being conducted from the property. Friday morning, Diana left me one final voicemail. Her voice was flat, defeated, completely different from the rage and manipulation of previous messages. She said she knew I'd never forgive her and probably shouldn't. She said she'd become someone she didn't recognize and didn't know how to stop being. She said she hoped one day I'd understand that she'd been broken long before I was born and had spent decades trying to fill an emptiness that nothing could fix. She said she was sorry, but it was the kind of sorry that came too late and cost too much to mean anything real. I deleted the voicemail without saving it. Her pain wasn't my responsibility to carry anymore. The breaking point came 2 weeks later when Diana tried one last desperate manipulation. She contacted Marcus's gym claiming she'd been sexually assaulted by him during a private training session, filing a formal complaint with management and threatening to go to police if they didn't fire him immediately. It was a nuclear option, the kind of accusation that destroys lives regardless of truth, and it was pure desperation from someone watching her carefully constructed world collapse and wanting to drag everyone down with her. Unfortunately for Diana, we'd anticipated exactly this move. Marcus had never trained her even once, something the gym's scheduling system could verify with date-stamped records. Every interaction they'd had was documented through security footage, text messages, and witnesses. When the gym's management reviewed her complaint against their records, they found 0 evidence Marcus had ever been alone with her in any professional capacity. They also found the messages Diana had sent Marcus that he'd forwarded to them weeks earlier, showing a pattern of harassment and unwanted advances from her toward him. The gym didn't just dismiss her complaint. They filed a police report against Diana for filing a false report and harassment. Marcus's ex-husband, who'd been building a case with the district attorney's office, added this to the growing list of Diana's illegal activities. Filing a false sexual assault claim was a felony in our state, carrying potential jail time and mandatory registration as a vexatious litigant. Diana had crossed from civil wrongs into criminal territory, and this time there were too many witnesses and too much documentation for her to talk her way out. Tuesday afternoon, Diana was arrested at her apartment. The charges included extortion related to the blackmail of 3 men who'd provided evidence and sworn statements, filing a false police report regarding Marcus, and fraud related to her theft from my grandmother's estate that my aunt had documented. The bail was set at $50,000, which Diana couldn't make, because most of the men she'd been extracting money from had stopped paying once the blog post went public. She spent 3 days in county jail before her lawyer managed to get her released on her own recognizance, but the damage was done. The local news covered her arrest because one of the men she'd extorted was a minor local politician whose wife had contacted media outlets with their story once she learned there were multiple other victims. Diana's mugshot was everywhere. Her real estate company immediately terminated her employment and sent letters to all her previous clients offering assistance in case they wanted to review transactions for any irregularities. Her landlord began eviction proceedings, citing the criminal charges and the constant disruptions to other tenants from people showing up to confront Diana about her behavior. Friday morning, I received a call from a producer at a true crime podcast asking if I'd be willing to be interviewed about Diana's case. Apparently, someone had connected the blog post to the arrest and realized there was a much larger story here about long-term psychological abuse and manipulation within families. They wanted to do a full episode exploring how predators could operate for decades within family structures because victims felt too ashamed or confused to come forward. I agreed, but only if my identity could be protected, and if they'd also interview some of the male victims to show the full scope of Diana's behavior. The podcast episode was released 3 weeks later and immediately went viral. It had over 500,000 downloads in the first 48 hours, with people sharing it across social media and discussing how many Diana-like figures existed in their own families. The producer told me they received hundreds of messages from people sharing similar stories, creating a whole series about toxic parents and family predators. Diana's case became a reference point, a way for people to understand and articulate what they'd experienced but hadn't known how to name. Diana's criminal trial was set for 6 months out, giving prosecutors time to build a comprehensive case. In the meantime, the civil lawsuits started. 3 of the men she'd blackmailed filed suit for return of money plus damages. My aunt filed suit for her portion of my grandmother's estate that Diana had stolen. Marcus filed suit for harassment and defamation over the false sexual assault claim. Each lawsuit added to the pile of legal consequences Diana was facing, and her lawyer privately told one of the plaintiffs that he'd advised Diana to consider bankruptcy because there was no way she could afford to fight or settle all these cases. Throughout all of this, Diana tried multiple times to contact me. She sent letters that the post office forwarded to my new address. I'd filed a change of address specifically to avoid her knowing where I'd moved. She created new social media accounts after I blocked her old ones, trying to send messages that oscillated between begging for forgiveness and accusing me of ruining her life out of spite. She called my workplace so many times I had to get a formal restraining order, which she violated twice before her lawyer convinced her that any more violations would result in additional jail time. The restraining order hearing was the first time I'd seen Diana in person since the day she'd left my apartment. She looked terrible. Her hair hadn't been done, her expensive clothes had been replaced with rumpled discount store outfits, and she'd aged years in just a few months. She kept trying to make eye contact with me while the judge reviewed the evidence of her continued harassment. When the judge granted a 5-year restraining order with provisions that Diana could not contact me directly or indirectly through any means, Diana started crying and saying this wasn't fair, that I was her daughter, and she had a right to talk to me. The judge was a woman in her 60s, who'd clearly seen every manipulation tactic in existence. She told Diana that parental rights came with parental responsibilities, and someone who'd systematically abused and exploited their child had forfeited any claim to a relationship. She told Diana that she should be grateful she was only facing restraining orders and not more serious charges related to the harm she'd caused me over decades. She told Diana to get therapy and to leave me alone, and that any violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and jail time with no bail. After the hearing, Marcus's ex-husband told me privately that the district attorney's office was considering additional charges related to identity theft because Diana had apparently been using my personal information to open credit cards and run up debt in my name over several years. I'd discovered this while checking my credit report after everything started unraveling, finding 3 cards I'd never opened with a total balance of nearly $40,000. This added another criminal charge to Diana's mounting legal troubles and gave me grounds to dispute the debt and clear my credit report. By the time Diana's criminal trial finally happened, she'd lost everything. Her apartment through eviction, her car through repossession because she couldn't make payments, her professional license permanently revoked, most of her possessions sold to try to pay legal fees. She showed up to court looking like a different person from the polished, predatory woman who dominated my life for so long. Her lawyer had negotiated a plea deal to avoid trial. Diana would plead guilty to 2 counts of extortion and 1 count of filing a false police report in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in prison, followed by 5 years probation. She'd have to pay restitution to the men she'd extorted, and to me for the identity theft. She'd have to complete mandatory therapy and would be prohibited from contacting any of her victims or their families. If she violated probation, she'd serve an additional 3 years. Diana cried during sentencing, trying one last time to give a speech about how she was a victim of circumstances and mental illness. The judge cut her off and told her that millions of people dealt with mental illness without becoming predators, and that her behavior was a choice she'd made repeatedly over decades. As they led Diana away in handcuffs, she looked at me one final time. I'd wondered how I'd feel at this moment, watching my mother being taken to prison as a direct result of my actions in exposing her. I'd worried I might feel guilty or sad or conflicted. Instead, I felt nothing except a bone-deep relief that she couldn't hurt anyone else for at least the next year and a half. And even after release, the legal consequences and public exposure would make it much harder for her to find new victims. The aftermath of Diana's sentencing brought unexpected revelations. 2 days after she was transferred to the women's correctional facility, I received a call from a detective in a city 3 hours away. They'd been investigating a series of fraud cases targeting elderly men through romance scams, and Diana's arrest had flagged in their system because the pattern matched several of their unsolved cases. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide information about Diana's methods and history, believing she might have been operating in their jurisdiction during periods when she'd told family she was traveling for work. I spent 4 hours with that detective and his partner, walking them through everything I knew. They showed me profiles from dating websites that Diana had created using fake names and photos, sometimes stealing pictures from other women's social media accounts. They had evidence she'd been running these scams for at least 7 years, targeting widowers and divorced men between 60 and 75 who had substantial retirement savings. She'd convinced at least 12 men to send her money for various fabricated emergencies, accumulating over $200,000 before the pattern became obvious enough that law enforcement started investigating. The detective explained that romance scams targeting elderly victims were particularly insidious because the victims often felt too embarrassed to report being fooled, meaning the actual number of people Diana had defrauded was probably much higher than what they'd documented. Some of the men had lost their entire life savings. One had taken out a second mortgage on his house to help Diana with a medical emergency that never existed. Another had withdrawn his retirement account early, paying massive tax penalties because Diana had convinced him they were going to start a business together and needed startup capital. This new information added federal fraud charges to Diana's legal troubles. The detective said she'd likely face additional prison time once the investigation was complete, possibly being transferred to federal custody to serve consecutive sentences. He apologized for what I'd gone through, saying that people like Diana often started with smaller manipulations within their families and escalated to larger crimes as they refined their techniques and became more confident they wouldn't face consequences. My exposure of her behavior had likely prevented her from victimizing countless more people. 3 weeks after Diana started serving her sentence, I received a letter from her. Prison mail was monitored, so I knew it had been reviewed before being sent to me. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten, with Diana's usually perfect penmanship degraded to scratchy, uneven lines. She tried various approaches within those pages, apologizing for specific incidents while justifying others, claiming she'd been suffering from undiagnosed mental illness that made her unable to control her impulses, begging me to write back and tell her how I was doing because she still loved me despite everything. The final page was different from the rest. Diana wrote that she'd been required to attend group therapy sessions in prison, and her therapist had made her write a letter taking full accountability for her actions without excuses or justifications. This section was shorter, more honest. She acknowledged that she'd viewed people as objects to be manipulated for her benefit. She admitted that she'd targeted my relationships specifically because she'd been jealous of my youth and possibilities. She confessed that she'd enjoyed the power she felt when she successfully seduced men away from me, that it had made her feel desirable and in control in ways nothing else did. I read the letter once, then put it in a folder with all the other documentation from Diana's case. I didn't respond. Part of me recognized that the honest section might have been genuine self-reflection, but it didn't change anything. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't obligate you to forgive them or maintain a relationship with them. Diana had spent decades destroying my relationships, sabotaging my career, stealing from family, and preying on vulnerable people. A few paragraphs of accountability written under court-ordered therapy didn't undo any of that damage. Marcus and I continued training together, and he eventually introduced me to his circle of friends, several of whom became genuine friends of mine as well. Julian taught me about digital privacy and security, helping me lock down my personal information so Diana couldn't access it once she was released. Through them, I met people who'd had similar experiences with toxic family members and had successfully built new lives separate from those relationships. They showed me that family is who shows up for you and supports your well-being, not just who shares your DNA. 6 months into Diana's sentence, my aunt called to tell me that several distant relatives had been contacting her, asking if the stories about Diana were really true, or if I'd exaggerated for attention. These were people who'd had minimal contact with our immediate family, but felt entitled to opinions about the situation. My aunt had been shutting down these conversations, but she wanted to warn me that some relatives were planning to write letters to the parole board when Diana became eligible, advocating for early release and claiming she'd been punished enough. She wanted me to be prepared to write my own statement, opposing early release if I felt comfortable doing so. I thanked her for the warning, but told her I wouldn't be writing anything to the parole board. Diana's sentence was decided by a judge, based on her criminal actions, and she needed to serve the time she'd been given. Whether certain relatives thought that was fair wasn't my concern. I'd done what I needed to do by exposing her pattern of behavior and cooperating with law enforcement. The rest was up to the justice system. My energy was better spent building my own life than remaining focused on Diana's consequences. That life was coming together in ways I hadn't expected. My career was thriving now that Diana wasn't sabotaging opportunities. I'd been promoted twice in 8 months, partially because my boss felt guilty about having doubted me in the past and was going out of her way to support my advancement. I'd moved into a new apartment in a building with excellent security and had adopted a rescue dog who'd been abandoned by his previous owner, finding unexpected comfort in caring for something that had also been betrayed by someone it trusted. I'd even started dating again, though cautiously. Marcus had introduced me to a colleague from his gym who was genuine, kind, and had no connection to my past. We were taking things slowly, both of us having been burned by previous relationships. He knew the basics of what had happened with Diana, but I didn't burden him with every detail. It was refreshing to be with someone who saw me as a separate person, rather than as Diana's daughter or her victim. The podcast episode about Diana's case continued to generate responses and attention. The producer told me they'd received messages from over 3,000 people sharing similar experiences with maternal competition and manipulation. Several therapists had reached out asking to use the episode in their work with clients who struggled to articulate their family dynamics. A researcher studying narcissistic personality disorder wanted to interview me for a book she was writing about long-term psychological abuse within families. The case had become larger than just my experience, serving as a touchstone for understanding a type of abuse that was often minimized or dismissed. Diana's criminal trial for the federal fraud charges was scheduled for 2 months after her state sentence ended. The prosecutor handling the case contacted me to explain that they had overwhelming evidence, and Diana's lawyer was likely to recommend she accept another plea deal rather than go to trial. If convicted on all counts, she'd face an additional 5 to 7 years in federal prison. Combined with her state sentence, Diana would be incarcerated for most of her 50s, emerging with a felony record that would make it nearly impossible to victimize people the way she had in the past. I asked the prosecutor what happened to people like Diana after they served time for these kinds of crimes. He said it varied, but most struggled to rebuild their lives because their criminal records limited employment options and their reputations in their communities were destroyed. Some moved to new areas and tried to start over. Some continued trying to manipulate and scam people, but with less success because they'd been flagged in various databases, Some actually changed, though he admitted those cases were rare. Most just became smaller, sadder versions of themselves, having lost everything they'd accumulated through their predatory behavior. 14 months after Diana was sentenced, I received notification that she'd be eligible for parole review in 4 months. The parole board would consider her behavior in prison, completion of required programs, and statements from victims before deciding whether to grant early release or require her to serve her full sentence. I was invited to submit a statement or appear at the hearing if I wanted to express my views about her potential release. Several of the men she'd victimized received similar notifications and were coordinating their responses. I thought about it for weeks before deciding I would submit a written statement, but wouldn't appear in person. I didn't want to see Diana again, didn't want to give her the opportunity to try manipulating me with her presence or performance of remorse. Instead, I wrote 5 pages detailing the decades of harm she'd caused, not just to me, but to the numerous people whose lives she'd damaged through her predatory behavior. I included documentation of her violations of the restraining order through third parties and evidence that she'd been trying to access my social media through fake accounts, even while incarcerated. The parole board denied Diana's early release, citing the severity and pattern of her crimes, along with evidence she'd continued manipulative behavior even while serving time. She'd have to serve her full state sentence before facing federal charges. The decision meant I wouldn't have to worry about her being released for at least another year, and then only into federal custody. It was a small relief but significant, providing more time for me to build a life completely separate from her influence. It's been 3 years since Diana was arrested. She's currently serving her federal sentence at a facility in another state, and I haven't had any contact with her since that first letter she sent from county jail. The restraining order remains in place, extended automatically when she was convicted of the federal charges. Occasionally, I get notifications that she's tried to contact me through prison email systems or has had other inmates try to friend me on social media, but these attempts are increasingly rare and pathetic rather than threatening. My life looks nothing like it did when Diana was free. I'm engaged to Ryan, the man Marcus introduced me to, and we're building something real and healthy based on actual trust and respect. He's met my aunt and the friends who supported me through exposing Diana, and they all agree he's nothing like the men Diana targeted. He's secure enough in himself that he doesn't need validation through manipulation, and he's genuinely happy when I succeed rather than threatened by my accomplishments. Marcus remains one of my closest friends, and I'm godmother to the daughter he and Julian adopted last year. We still train together twice a week, and he jokes that I'm his longest-lasting client since most people quit after 6 months when they realize getting fit requires actual work. The gym promoted him to training director after Diana's false accusation case was resolved, specifically citing his professionalism in handling an attempted manipulation that would have destroyed a lesser person's career. My career has flourished without Diana sabotaging opportunities. I'm now senior marketing director at my company, making more money than I ever imagined when I was struggling to understand why promotions kept falling through, despite excellent performance reviews. My boss, who received one of Diana's poison pen emails years ago, has become a mentor and advocate, often citing my resilience as inspiration when coaching other employees through difficult situations. The men Diana victimized have mostly moved on with their lives. Some marriages survived the revelation of affairs and manipulation. Others didn't, but the men I've stayed in contact with have all said that knowing the truth, however painful, was better than continuing to be manipulated or feeling crazy for suspecting something was wrong. Tyler, my ex from college, actually reached out on the anniversary of Diana's arrest to thank me for exposing her. He said carrying the guilt and confusion of what happened had affected his relationships for years, and finally understanding the full context had freed him to forgive himself. The blog post Julian created remains online, now serving as a resource for people trying to understand toxic family dynamics. It's been viewed over 3 million times and has generated countless conversations about maternal manipulation and the particular kind of damage done when a parent views their child as competition. Several therapists have told me they've used it with clients who struggled to articulate their experiences because society expects mothers to be nurturing and protective, making it hard to acknowledge when they're actually predatory. Diana will be released from federal custody in approximately 18 months. She'll be 60 years old with a felony record, no professional license, and a well-documented history that makes her easily searchable online. The parole conditions will include continued therapy, prohibitions on certain activities like working in real estate or financial services, and ongoing restrictions on contacting her victims. She'll essentially be starting over with nothing, and the life she built through decades of manipulation and predation will be impossible to recreate. My aunt keeps me updated on Diana's situation through her lawyer, who handles the remaining civil matters. Diana will be in debt for the rest of her life from the restitution payments and judgments against her. Her Social Security benefits will be garnished to pay these debts, leaving her with minimal income. Her employment options are limited both by her age and her criminal record. Her reputation in the community where she lived for decades is destroyed beyond repair. The relatives who initially wanted to advocate for her early release have mostly stopped contacting my aunt about her after realizing the scope of what Diana had done. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about what happened to Diana, if I regret exposing her behavior knowing it would destroy her life. The answer is simple. No. Diana destroyed her own life through decades of choices she made repeatedly and deliberately. She didn't accidentally manipulate dozens of people. She didn't unintentionally commit fraud against elderly men. She didn't mistakenly sabotage my relationships and career opportunities. Every single action was calculated and purposeful, done with full knowledge that she was causing harm but without caring because she prioritized her own gratification over anyone else's well-being. What I did was stop protecting her from the consequences of her own actions. For years, I'd made excuses for her behavior, minimized the damage she caused, and kept silent about what she'd done because I'd been conditioned to believe that family loyalty meant accepting abuse. Exposing Diana wasn't revenge. It was refusing to continue being complicit in her victimization of others. Every person she would have targeted after me was spared because I finally said enough. The most important lesson I've learned is that you don't owe loyalty to people who use that loyalty as a weapon against you. Diana spent decades relying on my love and trust to keep me silent while she destroyed my relationships and opportunities. She counted on my desire to believe she was capable of maternal love to excuse behavior that was actually predatory. She weaponized the social expectation that daughters should forgive their mothers no matter what, using that expectation as a shield to avoid accountability. I'm not angry anymore. That anger burned hot and bright during the initial exposure and legal proceedings, fueling my determination to document everything and ensure Diana faced consequences. But anger is exhausting to maintain, and I refuse to let Diana continue taking energy from me even through my rage at her actions. Now I simply feel nothing when I think of her, like she's someone I read about rather than someone who shaped decades of my life. She's irrelevant to who I am now. My wedding is in 6 months and Diana won't be there. She won't walk me down any aisle or give any tearful mother of the bride speeches. She won't meet her future grandchildren if Ryan and I decide to have kids. She'll spend the rest of her life watching from prison, and then from whatever diminished existence she manages to scrape together afterward, as I build a life she has no access to and no knowledge of. That's not a punishment I'm imposing. It's simply the natural consequence of being a predator whose prey finally fought back. To everyone reading this who has a Diana in their life, whether it's a parent or another family member or someone else using family connection as cover for abuse, please know that you're not obligated to protect their secrets or absorb their damage to keep the peace. The peace they want you to keep is actually your silence, and that silence enables them to continue hurting you and others. Speaking up isn't betrayal. It's refusal to betray yourself any longer. Diana is currently appealing her federal conviction, claiming her lawyer provided inadequate defense. The appeal will be denied because her lawyer was competent, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. She's also reportedly writing a book about her experiences, trying to position herself as a victim of a vengeful daughter, and a justice system that doesn't understand complex family dynamics. No publisher will touch it because liability laws protect people from being defamed in published works, and everything she'd need to claim to make herself sympathetic would be legally actionable false statement. Last week, I received a message from a woman who'd seen the podcast episode about Diana's case. She was reaching out because her own mother had been displaying similar patterns of behavior, and hearing my story had given her the language and framework to understand what was happening. She wanted advice on how to protect herself while gathering evidence. I spent 2 hours on the phone with her, walking her through the steps I'd taken and connecting her with the resources that had helped me. This is the real value of exposing predators. Not revenge or punishment, but preventing future victims and helping current ones escape. My life is peaceful now in ways it never was when Diana was free. I don't constantly second-guess my relationships wondering if my mother will target them. I don't worry about sabotage job opportunities or stolen mail or financial identity theft. I don't walk on eggshells trying to manage someone else's emotions and ego. I simply exist as myself, building relationships and opportunities based on my own merit, rather than constantly defending against deliberate undermining. Diana made her choices across decades of behavior. She chose manipulation over honesty, predation over protection, and self-gratification over maternal responsibility. She chose to target vulnerable men and her own daughter, rather than address whatever internal emptiness drove her behavior. Those choices led inevitably to her current circumstances. She's not a victim of my exposure. She's experiencing the consequences of her own sustained pattern of criminal and abusive behavior. And I'm finally completely, permanently free.